Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Flux, and this is General Psychology. Welcome to Module 4, where we delve into the fascinating world of behavioral psychology. This module explores the way behavior is shaped by the nature of stimuli and the reinforcement of particular patterns of behavior. But before we dive in, let's take a quick look back at Module 3 and test your memory with a couple review questions. Which of the following is an example of the recency effect in memory? A. Remembering the last few items on a shopping list. B. Forgetting information presented in the middle of a lecture. C. Recalling the first few words from a list presented to you. Or D. Remembering a particularly unusual or emotional event. The correct answer is A. The recency effect refers to the tendency to remember items presented at the end of a list because they were most recently reviewed. In memory research, what is the primary difference between recognition and recall? A. Recognition relies on cues, while recall does not. B. Recall is easier than recognition. C. Recognition occurs in short-term memory, while recall occurs in long-term memory. Or D. Recall involves identifying information from a list. The answer here is A. Recognition involves identifying information when you see it, while recall requires retrieving information without cues. Great work! Module 3 taught us about cognition and the mind. In Module 4, we're shifting gears to understand how behaviors are shaped and influenced, often without conscious thought. In this lecture, we'll start with Ivan Pavlov's groundbreaking work on classical conditioning and explore how associations are formed between stimuli and responses. We'll also take a look at the key components of classical conditioning, like neutral stimuli and conditioned responses, the importance of timing and order in learning, a few real-world applications like the Garcia effect, and what Watson's famous Little Albert experiment teaches us about stimulus generalization. Now, when I think of behaviorism, there's a classic Far Side comic that always comes to mind. Here, you can see one amoeba saying to another, stimulus response, don't you ever think? Believe it or not, early behaviorists would argue that thinking doesn't matter much. They believe that our behaviors are shaped entirely by stimuli and responses, not internal thoughts or feelings. Today, we're exploring this perspective by diving into classical conditioning, a key concept in behaviorism. By the end of this lecture, you'll see how this foundational concept explains behaviors in both humans and animals. So are you ready to explore the world of stimuli and response? Let's begin with the story of Ivan Pavlov. Pavlov was a Russian scientist who, by chance, discovered one of the most fundamental principles of behaviorism while studying digestion. Pavlov initially set out to explore the physiology of salivary glands in dogs, but what he found changed the course of psychology forever. To understand Pavlov's discovery, imagine this. Pavlov had several dogs in a lab with their salivary ducts surgically redirected to external tubes to precisely measure salivation. The dogs were harnessed in place to eliminate extraneous movements, and Pavlov's team meticulously recorded their reactions to various stimuli. Initially, they were studying a straightforward biological response, but something unexpected happened. The dogs started salivating before they were given food, sometimes just at the sound of footsteps or the creak of a door. This unintentional discovery laid the foundation for what we now call classical conditioning. Let's break it down. Pavlov observed that food naturally triggered salivation in the dogs. This is a natural and unlearned response. But, over time, the dogs began salivating in response to things that had nothing to do with food, like the sound of a door opening. How did this happen? Pavlov realized that the dogs had learned to associate a previously neutral stimulus with food. This association caused them to salivate even when no food was present. So he went about designing an experiment to test the process that linked these two things together in depth. To do so, he used a metronome. Not a bell as most people think. This created a standard cue that food was coming. In classical conditioning, we're going to be using very specific terminology. Let me introduce you to each. First, we have the neutral stimulus, or NS. Then we have the unconditioned stimulus, or UCS. There's the unconditioned response, or UCR, the conditioned stimulus, or CS, and the conditioned response, or CR. Let's take a look at what each of these was in Pavlov's experiment. At first, the sound of the metronome didn't cause salivation. It was neutral, hence the neutral stimulus, or NS. Food naturally caused salivation without any learning. So in this experiment, Pavlov and his team was using meat powder, which served as the unconditioned stimulus, or UCS. The dog's salivation in response to meat powder was automatic and unlearned, hence the unconditioned response, or UCR. After repeatedly pairing the metronome, or NS, with the meat powder, the UCS, the metronome then became a conditioned stimulus, or CS. Eventually, the metronome alone triggered salivation, which now became a conditioned response, or CR. Let's think about your own experiences. Can you identify a neutral stimulus that became meaningful because it was paired with something else? Let's watch an example of how a college student classically conditioned his roommate.
Hey Psych 101 class, I'm David and I'm going to be testing Pavlov's theory of classical conditioning on my roommate Brian. The conditioned stimulus will be this sound effect.
That was easy.
And then I'm going to shoot him with this airsoft gun. He will soon learn the relationship between the sound effect and the shot before he gets too hurt.
That was easy. That was easy.
Ah!
That was easy.
Fuck.
That was easy. That was easy.
Alright guys, looks like Pavlov's theory worked.
I wouldn't recommend repeating this unless you want to get on your roommate's bad side, but it does demonstrate a real-world example of classical conditioning at work. This was done by pairing the initially neutral stimulus, the "that was easy" button, with an airsoft gun, which acted as an unconditioned stimulus to trigger flinching to avoid pain, the unconditioned response. After several pairings, the NS became the conditioned stimulus, or CS, and the conditioned response became flinching. Classical conditioning isn't just about pairing a stimulus and a response. It's also about timing. The sequence and timing of when the neutral stimulus, or NS, and the unconditioned stimulus, or UCS, are presented play a critical role in determining how effectively an association is learned. Let's break this down by looking at the different pairing methods. First up is simultaneous pairing. This is when the NS and the UCS are presented at the exact same time. Using Pavlov's experiment as our example, this would be as if the metronome ticks at the same moment that food is delivered. This method isn't that effective because the neutral stimulus doesn't predict the unconditioned stimulus. It just coincides with it. Next up is forward short delay pairing. In this pairing, the NS is presented just before the UCS, with only a short delay between the two. In Pavlov's experiment, this was when the metronome started ticking just before the food was presented. This method is the most effective method to pair stimulus and response because the NS becomes a reliable predictor of the UCS. Next, we have forward long delay pairing. In this pairing, the NS is presented long before the UCS. This would be as if the metronome was ticking, but the food wasn't presented until several seconds or even minutes later. This method isn't as effective because the delay makes it harder to connect the two stimuli. Finally, we have backward pairing. In this, the UCS is presented before the NS. In Pavlov's experiment, this would be as if the food was delivered and then the metronome ticked. This is the least effective pairing method because the neutral stimulus fails to act as a predictor of the unconditioned stimulus. Why does forward short delay pairing work best? Forward short delay pairing stands out because it has predictive value. The close timing makes it clear that the NS predicts the UCS. It allows for the formation of stronger associations. The brain forms a stronger connection when one event reliably and quickly signals another. It leads to easier learning. The consistent sequence makes it easier to recognize the relationship between stimuli. Let's do an attention check. Which of the following pairing methods is generally the most effective in classical conditioning, and why? Is it A, simultaneous pairing, because the neutral stimulus and unconditioned stimulus occur together, ensuring maximum association? B, backward pairing, because presenting the unconditioned stimulus first ensures a stronger response? C, forward short delay pairing, because the neutral stimulus precedes the unconditioned stimulus by a short interval, providing predictive value? Or D, forward long delay pairing, because the longer time between the stimuli strengthens long-term learning? The correct answer here is C, forward short delay pairing. This method is most effective because the close timing between the neutral stimulus, or NS, and the unconditioned stimulus, or UCS, helps encourage learning that the NS reliably predicts the UCS. Now that we've explored timing in order, let's look at some naturalistic applications of classical conditioning, a phenomenon called the Garcia effect. Unlike most forms of learning, this one can happen just after a single pairing. Imagine this. A student snacks on her favorite goldfish crackers before suddenly coming down with a case of appendicitis. Unfortunately for her, appendicitis comes with quite a bit of nausea and vomiting. From that day forward, just the sight of goldfish crackers makes her stomach churn. This is the Garcia effect in action, a unique form of classical conditioning where a single experience is enough to create a strong aversion to certain tastes. Unlike traditional conditioning, the Garcia effect breaks many of the rules we just learned. It involves single trial learning. In typical conditioning, most associations require multiple pairings of the NS and UCS. In the Garcia effect, just a single pairing of the food with sickness can establish a lifelong aversion. It also can involve a long delay between stimuli. In typical conditioning, the NS and UCS are presented within seconds of each other. In the Garcia effect, hours can pass between eating a food and feeling sick, yet the association still forms. This aversion is highly specific to the taste and smell of the food involved. It doesn't generalize to other sensory experiences like sight and sound. Once learned, taste aversions are incredibly persistent, often lasting a lifetime, even if the person logically knows that the food they're avoiding wasn't the cause of their illness. So why is the Garcia effect so powerful? Evolution provides the answer. For our ancestors, eating something toxic could mean the difference between life and death. Learning to avoid potentially harmful foods after just one bad experience was a crucial survival mechanism. Interestingly, our student's aversion was specific to goldfish crackers, not all crackers. This is an example of stimulus discrimination. She learned to associate sickness with one specific food but not others. The ability to discriminate between safe and unsafe stimuli is another survival advantage here. The Garcia effect isn't just an academic curiosity. It has real-world applications. Researchers Nicolas and colleagues in 1983 used the Garcia effect to protect endangered bird eggs from predators like crows. The researchers wanted to prevent the crows from stealing endangered eggs. By injecting some eggs with lithium chloride to induce sickness, they taught crows to avoid eating eggs altogether, helping to preserve species populations. The crows then stopped stealing the eggs. While stimulus discrimination in the Garcia effect helps us to focus on one specific trigger, classical conditioning also has a flip side: stimulus generalization. To see this concept in action, we'll explore one of psychology's most infamous experiments, the Little Albert study. Classical conditioning isn't just about salivating dogs and taste aversions. It's also about learning emotions, like fear, as we saw in the roommate example. One of the most famous demonstrations of this was the Little Albert experiment, conducted by John Watson in the early 20th century. This controversial and now clearly unethical study aimed to show that fear, like other behaviors, could be learned through classical conditioning. In the experiment, Watson worked with a young child known as Little Albert. Let's break it down using the components of classical conditioning. At first, Albert showed no fear of a white rat. The white rat was neutral, the neutral stimulus, or NS. It didn't elicit any specific reaction. Watson then introduced a loud, startling noise by striking a steel bar. Naturally, this caused Albert to cry, hence it was the unconditioned stimulus, or UCS. And the crying was Albert's automatic, unlearned reaction to the loud noise, the unconditioned response, or UCR. Watson then paired the white rat, or the neutral stimulus, with the loud noise, the unconditioned stimulus, repeatedly. Over time, Albert began to cry, now a conditioned response, or CR, just at the sight of the white rat, now a conditioned stimulus, or CS. What makes this study even more unsettling is what happened next. Albert's fear didn't remain specific to the white rat. He began to fear other white fluffy objects, like a Santa Claus mask and a fur coat, even though they hadn't been paired with the loud noise. This is called stimulus generalization, when a conditioned response spreads to stimuli that are similar to the original conditioned stimulus. In Albert's case, his learned fear of the white rat generalized to anything white and fluffy. While the Little Albert study is a textbook example of stimulus generalization, it's also a cautionary tale about ethics and research. Here's why. It didn't include consent. Little Albert's guardians likely weren't fully informed of the study's purpose or its potential psychological impact. It induced emotional distress. By intentionally inducing fear in a young child, it raised serious ethical concerns about the researchers' responsibility to their participants. And it led to lasting harm. Albert's fear response was never deconditioned, and while he ended up dying at age 6, had he not, he could have taken those fears with him into adulthood. Let's take a moment to reflect. Have you ever noticed a fear or preference that generalized to similar objects or situations? For example, does a bad experience with one dog make you cautious around all dogs? What kind of evolutionary benefit could stimulus generalization provide? Today we explored the foundational principles of classical conditioning. We discussed Pavlov's groundbreaking experiments and how neutral stimuli can become powerful triggers for learned responses. We learned the key concepts here: the neutral stimulus, NS, the unconditioned stimulus, UCS, conditioned stimulus, CS, and the resulting responses, the CR. We discussed the role of timing and order, showing how predictive value strengthens associations. We also learned about the Garcia effect, a remarkable example of how biological predispositions shape learning, as well as how it leads to stimulus discrimination. We ended discussing stimulus generalization through the infamous Little Albert study and the ethical questions that it raised. Classical conditioning isn't just a phenomenon in a lab. It's woven into the fabric of our everyday lives. From the jingles that make us crave fast food to the fears we develop after bad experiences, these principles help explain how we learn to navigate our world. Before we conclude, let's do a bit of review. Which of the following is an example of the Garcia effect? A. A dog salivating at the sound of a bell. B. Developing an aversion to shrimp after food poisoning. C. A child crying when they see a white rat. Or D. Associating a ringtone with excitement. The answer here is B. The Garcia effect is all about associating taste with sickness, often after just one experience. In the Little Albert study, what best illustrates stimulus generalization? Is it A. Albert's fear of the white rat? B. Albert's crying at the sound of the gong? C. Albert's fear of all white fluffy objects? Or D. Albert's eventual loss of fear through extinction? The answer here is C. Stimulus generalization occurs when a learned fear spreads to similar stimuli. Classical conditioning gives us powerful tools to understand and predict behavior, but it also reminds us of the importance of ethics in research. In our next lecture, we'll continue our exploration of behavior with a deep dive into operant conditioning, where the focus shifts from associations to the consequences of our behaviors. Until then, stay curious, stay resilient, and above all, live life in flux. Flux out. I'll see you in the next lecture.